Abigail Carter had spent most of her life believing that whatever felt incomplete inside her was simply part of who she was. Not grief, not loneliness, not some dramatic childhood wound she could point to and explain away. Just absence. The kind that sat quietly beneath everything. At 24, Abigail lived in Portland, Maine, in a modest apartment above a used bookstore where the owner barely remembered anyone's name. She taught literature at a public high school, kept predictable routines, answered emails on time, paid bills early, and maintained the kind of life that looked stable from the outside. Colleagues described her as dependable. Students described her as distant but fair. No one would have called her unhappy, but no one knew her well enough to say otherwise. Her mother, Diane Carter, had died 3 years earlier after a short illness that moved faster than anyone expected. Pancreatic cancer. By the time doctors confirmed it, there had been little left to discuss except timelines and medication. Abigail had handled everything the way she handled most things. Quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. The paperwork, the hospital calls, the funeral arrangements, the sale of her mother's old sedan, the unopened sympathy cards. People praised her strength. What they never understood was that grief had never arrived in the expected form. Because alongside loss had come something else. Relief. Not relief that Diane was gone. Relief that the silence was gone with her. Diane had loved Abigail. Of that, there had never been doubt. But Diane had also been a woman of locked doors. Questions about Abigail's father were always dismissed with vague explanations about complicated history and poor timing. Questions about extended family produced short answers. Questions about the hospital where Abigail was born always ended quickly. As a child, Abigail accepted this the way children accept weather. Adults had their reasons. Parents knew things children didn't. As an adult, she stopped asking. Until February 2021. The envelope was waiting in her mailbox on a Thursday morning. No return address. Cream-colored paper. Handwritten name. Abigail Carter. Not typed. Not printed. Handwritten. That alone felt strange. Who still sent letters? Inside was a single slip of paper. 8 words. She didn't die. They gave her away. Abigail read the sentence once. Then again. Then several more times, as if repetition might force meaning into place. She had no sister. No brother. No known half-siblings. Nothing. The message made no sense. At first, she assumed it was meant for someone else. A mistake. A prank. Some bizarre cruelty. But the handwriting used her full name. The apartment address was correct. Whoever sent it meant for her to read it. The rest of the workday passed in fragments. Students discussing assigned reading. Administrative emails. Faculty scheduling notices. A meeting she barely remembered attending. That sentence remained louder than everything else. That evening, Abigail opened the small keepsake box she had not touched in months. Contained only a few items. A childhood photograph. A hospital wristband from infancy. Baby teeth wrapped in tissue. And a necklace. A silver chain with half of a heart pendant. Not broken in the accidental sense. Separated. Cleanly. Her mother had always claimed it came from an old family friend. Abigail remembered asking where the other half was. Diane had answered simply that it had been lost. At the time, that explanation had seemed sufficient. Now it felt rehearsed. Under brighter light, Abigail noticed faint etching on the metal. Numbers. Incomplete. Worn with time. Impossible to interpret clearly. She placed the necklace beside the letter. 2 meaningless objects becoming suddenly heavy with possibility. Then came the second envelope. This one appeared outside her apartment door the following morning. Again, no return address. Different handwriting. Inside was a photograph. Old. Hospital issued. 2 newborns in separate bassinets. Matching wristbands. Matching dates. One labeled Carter A. The other Carter B. Abigail stared until disbelief became something colder. There had been 2 babies. Not one. No explanation accompanied the image. No note. No name. Just evidence. The realization landed with brutal simplicity. Someone had hidden an entire person from her. That same afternoon, Abigail retrieved the hospital wristband from the keepsake box again. Closer inspection revealed something strange beneath faded discoloration, as if old ink had once been covered. Careful examination exposed partial lettering underneath. Twin B. The room seemed to tilt around the fact. Twin. Not speculation. Not theory. Documentation. Abigail had spent 24 years believing herself an only child. Now physical proof suggested otherwise. Her thoughts turned immediately toward Diane. The evasions. The discomfort. The way certain topics disappeared the moment they surfaced. Had her mother known? No. That question barely survived a second. Of course she had known. The more painful question was why. Abigail drove to South Portland the next morning. Her childhood home had been sold after Diane's death, but remained temporarily unoccupied pending renovations. Abigail still knew too much about the place to stay away. Every unanswered question seemed to point backward, toward that house, toward the life Diane had controlled so carefully, toward the version of Abigail that had grown up inside a story written by someone else. Nothing obvious waited inside. No confession left in plain sight. No neatly packaged truth. Only absence. But absence itself had become suspicious. Abigail's memory of childhood had always felt strangely incomplete. Not traumatic, just fogged. Large sections blurred. Faces forgotten. Dates indistinct. She had accepted that as normal. Now she wondered how much had been omission instead of memory failure. Back at her apartment, Abigail searched public records related to the hospital listed on her birth certificate. St. Catherine Women's Medical Center. Closed in 1999. Licensing issues. Administrative misconduct. Missing documentation. Internal investigations. Scattered local reporting. No definitive scandal summary. Just fragments. Enough to create unease. Not enough to explain anything. That evening, Abigail received no third envelope. No instructions. No identity. No demand. Only silence, which somehow felt worse, because whoever had started this wanted her to continue digging. That much was obvious. This was not random cruelty. It was deliberate. Someone had preserved records. Someone had chosen timing. Someone knew the truth. And someone believed Abigail deserved to know it. Sleep became impossible. Thoughts spiraled through possibilities she could barely tolerate. Illegal adoption. Medical fraud. Family deception. A secret sibling. A dead child. A living child. A stranger sharing her face somewhere in America. The idea felt absurd, and yet less absurd than the evidence already sitting on her kitchen table. By Sunday morning, Abigail understood something irreversible had happened. Even if the truth proved devastating. Even if it destroyed every comforting story she had inherited. She could not return to not knowing. Because once a lie becomes visible, normal life becomes performance. And for the first time in 24 years, Abigail Carter understood that her life might not have begun the way she had been told. Somewhere, another version of her story existed. And someone had just opened the door. By Monday morning, Abigail Carter had stopped asking whether the letters were real. The better question was who wanted her to know. Because whoever this person was had not sent rumors. They had sent proof. The hospital photograph had changed everything. The faded wristband had erased the last room for denial. Twin B was not a misunderstanding. It was documentation. And if Abigail had been Twin B, then Twin A had existed. Still existed if the first message was true. She didn't die. They gave her away. Abigail took a personal day from school for the first time in nearly 2 years. Her principal approved it without questions. Assuming illness. Abigail let that assumption stand. The drive to South Portland felt less like revisiting childhood and more like entering evidence. The Carter house had belonged to her mother for almost 30 years before being sold after Diane's death. Renovations had stalled after financing issues, leaving the property in a kind of bureaucratic limbo. Abigail still had an old copy of the backdoor key. Legally questionable, perhaps. Emotionally unavoidable. Everything inside felt wrong now. Not because anything had changed, but because Abigail had. The house no longer represented childhood memory. It represented concealment. She moved through rooms that had once seemed ordinary. The kitchen where Diane insisted on Sunday pancakes even when money was tight. The hallway where report cards had once been taped temporarily before being filed away. The spare room Diane used for tax paperwork and unopened storage bins. All of it now looked curated. Not fake. Edited. Abigail's old bedroom remained mostly untouched. The faded yellow paint. The outline where posters once hung. The cheap bookshelf Diane refused to replace until it finally collapsed. Abigail stood in the center of the room trying to force memory into sharper focus. Nothing dramatic came. No cinematic revelation. Only unease. Then something small surfaced. A floorboard. Loose. Not unusual in an older New England house. But familiar. As a child, Abigail remembered being told not to step near that corner because the board shifted. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now everything meant something. Underneath was a shallow gap. Inside sat a sealed plastic sleeve. Abigail already knew, before opening it, that she was not finding random clutter. Inside was a photograph. Hospital issued. 2 newborns. Same image composition as the anonymous photograph, but clearer. More official. On the back, written in Diane Carter's handwriting. Abigail and Natalie, July 14, 1997. Abigail read the sentence repeatedly. Natalie. A name transformed abstraction into reality. Not a possibility. Not twin A. Natalie. A real person. Person Diane had named. Which meant Diane had acknowledged her existence. Loved her enough to name her. And then somehow lost her. Or surrendered her. Or had her taken. The distinction mattered. But Abigail didn't know which truth belonged to her yet. She sat on the floor for a long time, not because of emotional collapse, but because movement felt irrelevant. Every assumption beneath her life had shifted. Her mother had not merely omitted information. She had buried it. Literally. By late afternoon, Abigail returned to Portland carrying the photograph, the necklace, the wristband, and a silence louder than anything she had known. That night, the 3rd envelope arrived. No knock. No warning. Just another anonymous delivery outside her apartment door. Thicker this time. Inside were photocopied documents. 2 birth certificates. Same birth date. July 14, 1997. Same mother. Diane Carter. One certificate listed Abigail Carter. The other listed Natalie Carter. Abigail examined every line repeatedly. Then came the hospital discharge paperwork. St. Catherine Women's Medical Center. Same attending physician. A doctor named Harold Mercer. Then the final sheet. A typed list of infant names with notes beside each. Some entries labeled adopted. Some marked transferred. One notation beside Natalie Carter stood out. Private placement. No agency listed. No adoption authority. No state documentation reference. Nothing. Just private placement. Abigail knew enough about American adoption law to understand how wrong that looked. Private adoptions existed, yes. But even private arrangements required legal oversight, attorneys, filings, court approval. This document looked less like lawful placement and more like internal shorthand for something deliberately vague. She opened her laptop and searched St. Catherine Women's Medical Center again. This time more aggressively. Archived newspaper databases, local reporting, public health records, old legal notices. Fragments emerged. Administrative misconduct, licensing irregularities, patient file discrepancies, an internal review board investigation in 1999, closure shortly afterward. Nothing directly naming baby trafficking or illegal adoption, but enough smoke to suggest fire. Abigail barely slept. By morning, another realization surfaced. There was one living person who might know something. Her aunt. Technically her mother's cousin. though Diane always referred to her simply as Aunt Margaret. No, not Margaret. That was her mother. This was Aunt Susan, a distant relative in New Hampshire. Holiday cards every few years. Minimal contact. Never close. But older family members often knew what younger ones were never told. Susan answered on the third ring. Abigail introduced herself. Polite small talk lasted under a minute. Then Abigail asked directly whether Diane had ever given birth to twins. Silence. Not confusion. Not denial. Silence. That silence answered more than words. Susan finally said she thought Abigail should speak to her mother. Abigail informed her that her mother had been dead for 3 years. Another silence. Then discomfort disguised as caution. Old things are complicated. People made difficult choices. That phrase landed badly. Abigail asked whether Natalie existed. Susan refused direct confirmation. But she did say something that mattered. Your mother loved you very much. Not both of you. Not your family. You. Precision mattered. Abigail ended the call with fewer answers and greater certainty. Her mother's side of the family knew, or suspected, or had chosen ignorance. At school, returning to routine became impossible. Student essays about family identity felt almost mocking. Literature discussions about truth and deception became unbearable. Even mundane interactions felt distorted. How do you discuss normal life when your own birth certificate might be only part of the story? By Thursday, Abigail understood she was no longer conducting private emotional archaeology. She was investigating potential fraud, possibly criminal history, possibly human trafficking disguised as family arrangement. And she was entirely unqualified to do it alone. That was when she remembered Noah Bennett. Not personally, only by reputation. Noah had graduated from a Portland-area high school before Abigail entered middle school. Older, local, the kind of person adults once described as trouble in expensive shoes. Now he ran an independent investigative newsletter based out of Boston covering municipal corruption, nonprofit abuse, judicial secrecy, and political misconduct. His work had earned both admiration and lawsuits. Abigail had read one of his pieces the previous year about mismanaged foster placements in Massachusetts. If anyone understood institutional cover-ups, it would be him. Reaching out felt irrational. Also necessary. She sent an email that night. Brief, professional, minimal details. Claimed possession of records suggesting concealed twin separation linked to a closed hospital. Expected no response. He replied in 27 minutes. 3 sentences. If authentic, this is serious. Don't send scans yet. Can you meet? Abigail read the message repeatedly. For the first time since the letters began, direction replaced chaos. But before she could respond, another detail in the hospital paperwork caught her attention. A case notation code. Small, almost meaningless, yet repeated across 2 forms. Abigail searched it. Nothing public, but enough to suggest internal classification, intentional categorization, systematic process, not isolated paperwork error. Natalie's disappearance no longer looked like a family tragedy. It looked organized. Abigail replied to Noah just after midnight. Boston works. Soon as possible. Then she sat in silence with the photograph of 2 newborn girls. Same date. Same mother. Same beginning. Completely different lives. And somewhere, if the documents were true, Natalie Carter was living adulthood without any idea that Abigail existed. Or worse, knowing exactly who Abigail was, and staying silent for reasons Abigail could not yet imagine. Noah Bennett did not look like the kind of man who should be trusted with family secrets. That was Abigail's first thought. Not because he seemed reckless, because he seemed observant in a way that suggested very little escaped him. He was in his early 30s, sharper around the edges than the local photos attached to his investigative work suggested, with the kind of professional detachment that usually belonged to attorneys or journalists who had spent too much time around institutional lies. Which Abigail suspected was exactly what he was. They met in Boston on a Saturday in March 2021. Abigail brought copies, not originals. birth certificates, hospital discharge forms, the photograph, the list of infant transfers, her hospital wristband, the necklace. Noah reviewed everything without interruption. No dramatic reaction, no exaggerated shock, just methodical silence. When he finally spoke, his conclusion was unsettlingly direct. If these documents were forged, someone had invested extraordinary effort. If they were authentic, this was potentially criminal. Not just family secrecy, systemic misconduct, possibly multiple victims. Abigail asked whether private infant placements like this had ever happened. Noah answered honestly, yes, especially before tighter interstate adoption oversight and better digital records. But legitimate private adoptions still generated legal documentation. This looked deliberately incomplete. Abigail explained the letters, the anonymous deliveries, the hidden photograph in Diane's house, her aunt's evasive response. Noah listened closely. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Did Abigail want family answers or public truth? Because those were not always compatible. Abigail's answer came easily. Natalie. She wanted Natalie. Everything else came second. Noah nodded. Then work began. The discharge documents listed the attending physician, Dr. Harold Mercer, retired, former OB/GYN affiliated with St. Catherine Women's Medical Center, now living in a senior independent living complex outside Portland. Noah suggested caution. Older physicians associated with institutional scandals often responded through attorneys, denial, or memory loss. Still, he agreed Mercer represented the fastest starting point. Abigail insisted on going. Noah preferred to accompany her. Abigail refused. This was still hers. The meeting happened 2 days later. Dr. Mercer was older than Abigail expected but cognitively sharp enough to be dangerous. At first, he claimed not to remember specific births from decades earlier. Reasonable. Expected. Then Abigail placed both birth certificates in front of him. Same mother. Same birth date. Twin records. Same physician signature. Something changed. Not confession. Recognition. The kind institutions try to hide beneath procedural distance. Mercer acknowledged the signatures appeared authentic. He admitted St. Catherine handled complicated private maternal cases in the late 90s. He denied knowledge of illegal infant transfer. When Abigail pressed harder, he became more cautious. Then one phrase slipped through. There were programs back then people wouldn't understand now. Programs. Plural. Not incident. Not error. System. When Abigail asked directly whether Natalie had been transferred, Mercer shut down completely. The meeting ended with more questions than answers. But one thing was now certain. The paperwork was not random fiction. That same evening, another envelope appeared. Abigail had stopped being surprised by the timing. Inside was a single photograph. A little girl, approximately 6 years old. Dark blonde hair, a red sweater, professional family portrait quality. On the back, Natalie 2003. Below that, partially smudged, an address. Greenwich, Connecticut. Abigail stared at the image longer than she expected. Not because the child looked unfamiliar, because she didn't. Same face shape, same expression, same unsettling resemblance to childhood photographs Abigail already owned. Noah immediately started tracing the address. Greenwich property records were public enough to identify ownership. William and Rebecca Hollowell. Affluent. Finance background. Substantial real estate history. No public adoption records connected to their names. Not unusual. Adoption files were sealed in many states. But Noah dug further. Archived charity gala listings. Private school donor directories. Social mentions. Family legal entities. Eventually a thread emerged. The Hollowells had added a daughter to tax documentation beginning in 1998. No birth announcement. No local newspaper family notice. No accessible adoption filing. Abigail asked the obvious question. Could this be coincidence? Noah answered without hesitation. No. The timeline fit too neatly. A girl roughly Natalie's age entered the Hollowell family 1 year after the hospital documentation. Abigail drove to Greenwich the following morning. Noah advised against impulsive contact. She went anyway, not to confront, only to confirm. The Hollowell residence was exactly what Abigail expected wealthy Connecticut inheritance to look like. Not because she cared about the property itself, but because everything about the records suggested privilege. Money, access, private legal handling, protected documentation. And there she was, a woman in her 20s, the same age as Abigail. The same features, refined differently by a completely different life. Same eyes, same jawline. Even from a distance, certainty landed instantly. Natalie. No DNA test. No paperwork in hand. Just recognition so immediate it felt biological. Abigail had imagined this moment differently. Maybe emotional. Maybe overwhelming. Instead it felt strangely clinical. Like identifying missing evidence. There she is. Proof. A human life split away from hers. Natalie existed. Alive. Adult. Real. Abigail did not approach her. Not yet. Because what exactly would she say? Hello, I think we were separated at birth through a possibly illegal arrangement connected to a closed hospital and our dead mother? Absurd. Terrifying. Potentially cruel. She drove back to Maine without contact. That night, she reopened the keepsake box. The necklace again. The hospital wristband again. Something about the wristband bothered her. The discoloration over the printed text. Too deliberate. Under closer inspection, residue suggested correction fluid. A cover-up. Careful removal exposed what she already suspected. Twin B. Confirmation. Again. As if the universe refused to allow denial. Abigail called Noah immediately. His reaction was practical, not sentimental. That changes everything. Because now evidence came from both institutional records and Abigail's personal belongings. Different origins. Same story. By this point, Noah was convinced this was larger than a single hidden adoption. He began examining St. Catherine's archival patterns more broadly. Old employee directories, public closure records, licensing hearings, board oversight complaints. The names began repeating. Certain physicians, administrative staff, legal intermediaries. Enough overlap to suggest structure. But no smoking gun yet. Abigail's focus remained narrower. Natalie. Who had she become? Did she know? Was she aware of any adoption at all? Or had she grown up believing an entirely different version of her life? Noah uncovered another relevant detail. The Hollowells had enrolled their daughter at an elite private school under the name Natalie Hollowell. Later records showed the adult woman no longer used that surname publicly. That suggested some kind of identity shift, marriage, name change, or deliberate separation from the adoptive family. Too early to know. Still, progress existed. Then another breakthrough. Noah identified internal metadata on one hospital transfer code matching a former St. Catherine administrative filing classification. That led to a former employee. Retired. Still alive. Possibly reachable. But before pursuing that lead, Abigail needed certainty about Natalie's placement history. So Noah requested private legal database access through a contact. Nothing formal surfaced. No public agency adoption case. No probate guardianship filing visible in ordinary search systems. No standard state adoption footprint. Meaning one of two things. Either records were deeply sealed, or the transfer had bypassed conventional channels. Both possibilities were disturbing. Abigail understood something by then that she had resisted earlier. This was no longer a hidden family tragedy. It was an investigation into deliberate concealment. And someone, possibly the same anonymous sender, was still feeding information in carefully measured pieces. The letters were not emotional outreach. They were controlled disclosures. Someone wanted Abigail moving step by step, toward truth, or toward something more dangerous. Late that week, Noah asked whether she had considered the possibility that Natalie already knew everything. The question unsettled Abigail more than she expected. If Natalie knew, why stay silent? If Natalie didn't, Abigail was about to destroy someone else's life the way hers had already been destroyed. Neither option offered comfort. Still, the path forward had narrowed. They had a likely identity, a likely adoptive family, institutional inconsistencies, a physician with partial knowledge, and a trail leading deeper into St. Catherine's buried records. Abigail should have felt closer to answers. Instead, she felt something worse, that this was only the surface, and whatever came next would be uglier than family deception alone. Abigail knew waiting would make her reckless, so she went to Greenwich anyway, not to create a scene, not to accuse anyone, only to force reality into something concrete. The Hollowell residents had already told Noah what public records could tell. Wealth, long-standing connections, clean legal visibility, charitable involvement, private institutions, carefully maintained reputation. The kind of family that understood how to keep sensitive matters out of public systems. Abigail rang the doorbell with no plan beyond honesty. A woman in her 60s answered, polished, controlled, the kind of face trained not to reveal surprise unless strategically useful. Abigail introduced herself, used her real name, no invented pretext. Noah would have hated that. Then Abigail said the sentence she had rehearsed repeatedly on the drive. She believed there had been an adoption involving a baby named Natalie Carter in the late 1990s. The woman's expression changed only slightly. Not confusion. Recognition. That was enough. Abigail continued, explaining that she believed Natalie might be biologically related to her. The woman did not deny Natalie existed, did not ask who Abigail was, did not request clarification. Instead, she shut the conversation down with the kind of immediate firmness that comes from preparation, not surprise. The message was unmistakable. Leave. No discussion. No explanation. No acknowledgement. The door closed. That should have been the end. Instead, it became confirmation. Because innocent people ask questions. People protecting secrets shut doors. As Abigail turned to leave, a voice from inside called quietly. Not Natalie. Younger. Female. Brief. Come back tonight. Midnight. Back entrance. No name. No further explanation. Abigail left without looking back. Noah's reaction when she called was immediate disbelief. Then frustration. Then practical concern. This could be a setup. Or finally a break. Either way, going alone was irresponsible. Abigail went alone. At midnight, the contact was waiting. 17, maybe 18. Nervous, intelligent, clearly terrified of being caught. Her name was Claire Hollowell, Natalie's cousin. Not central family, but close enough to overhear things children were never supposed to hear. Claire had recognized Abigail immediately. Not because anyone had shown her Abigail's photo, because resemblance did not require explanation. According to Claire, Natalie was not home. She had left earlier for New York. Timing that felt almost too convenient. Still, Claire knew enough to matter. She confirmed Natalie had been adopted privately. No agency involvement, at least none ever discussed openly. Family conversations always framed Natalie as a special arrangement. A blessing. A rescue. Language rich families often use when sanitizing morally uncomfortable decisions. Claire remembered Natalie asking questions as a teenager. Questions about origin, medical history, birth parents. Every inquiry had been shut down. Firmly. Emotionally. Sometimes cruelly. Then Claire handed Abigail something wrapped in tissue. A hospital wristband. Old plastic. Yellowed. Name printed clearly. Natalie W. And beneath it, Twin A. Abigail stared at the band in silence. Twin A. No more ambiguity. No more interpretive possibility. This was confirmation from Natalie's side of the divide. Claire explained she had found it years earlier hidden inside an old music box in storage. Natalie had never seen it. Or if she had, she never said. Claire's fear seemed genuine. Her request was simple. Do not mention her involvement. Abigail agreed, then drove directly to Boston. Noah was awake when she arrived. Not because journalists keep healthy schedules. Because investigative journalists expect catastrophe after midnight. The wristband changed everything. It established independent corroboration from two separate households. Two families. Two preserved artifacts. Same twin classification. Same timeline. Now Noah believed the story had escalated beyond hidden adoption. This suggested systematic concealment. He began pulling harder at institutional threads. Not through public Google searches anymore. Through professional contacts. Archive access. Subscription legal databases. Retired municipal clerks. One lead surfaced quickly. A former St. Catherine Administrative Records employee. Retired. Living outside Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Name Margaret Bell. Except that lead collapsed within hours. Deceased. Then another name. Eleanor Grant. Former records assistant. Memory decline. Unreliable. Then a third. Beatrice Hollowell. Age 81. Former administrative archivist. Still alive. Still in Maine. Still reachable. Noah arranged contact. But before meeting her, he wanted stronger documentary context. He continued reviewing hospital codes tied to Abigail's paperwork. Patterns emerged. Not dozens at first. Just enough to raise alarm. Infants with ambiguous transfer language. Private placements. Administrative override notes. Missing associated court references. Not proof yet, but enough to suggest Natalie was not unique. Abigail asked the question neither of them wanted answered. How many? Noah refused to guess. Meanwhile, Abigail's focus kept circling Natalie. Not the scandal. Not the hospital. Natalie, who had grown up with wealth, secrecy, and apparently fragmented truth. Did Natalie know she had a twin? Did the family tell her something else? Had she spent her life believing abandonment? Or death? Or some polished lie crafted for private school family narratives? Noah suggested caution before direct contact. Abigail agreed in theory, then ignored caution in practice. The next emotional collision came unexpectedly through research into adoption records. Nothing surfaced under Natalie Carter. Nothing under Natalie Hollowell in public adoption filings. Nothing in probate guardianship accessible through ordinary channels. Either records were sealed aggressively, or something bypassed normal legal process. Neither explanation comforted anyone. Then the first real breakthrough arrived. Beatrice Hollowell agreed to meet, not because of Noah's credentials, because he mentioned the phrase twin A. That detail got them through the door. Beatrice lived exactly how Abigail imagined elderly former institutional archivists might live, surrounded by paper, memory, and unresolved history. She did not welcome them warmly, not at first, but when Abigail showed Natalie's wristband, something changed. Recognition, guilt, fatigue. Beatrice admitted St. Catherine had ordered internal document destruction during its collapse period. She had not complied fully, not because she anticipated future justice, because some records felt wrong to destroy. Then came the box. Old file storage, labeling codes, archived copies. Not everything, but enough. Photographs, administrative transfer notes, birth documentation, duplicate internal logs, and confirmation. Abigail and Natalie had both been born at St. Catherine. Diane Carter had indeed delivered twins. Beatrice remembered Diane. That detail hit Abigail harder than expected. Her mother had not been faceless to the institution. Beatrice described Diane as quiet, frightened, isolated. No family visitors. Limited resources. But here came the contradiction. According to Beatrice, Diane left the hospital with both babies. Abigail went silent. That destroyed the assumption that Natalie had been taken immediately. If Diane had left with both daughters, then something happened later. Abigail asked what happened. Beatrice didn't know. Only this: 2 days later, a man arrived, requested access, produced paperwork, Removed one file from internal circulation. Administrative override. Questions discouraged. Standard intimidation. Beatrice remembered him because he behaved like someone accustomed to compliance. Name? Yes. She remembered. Richard Hollowell. The name landed like impact. Same surname as Natalie's adoptive family. Noah reacted first, because he recognized it immediately. Political donor networks. State-level connections. Quiet influence in late 90s Maine administrative circles. Not celebrity-level power. Worse, invisible power. The kind that opens private doors. Abigail finally understood what Noah had suspected. This was never about a single desperate adoption. It was infrastructure, organized, protected, institutional, and someone with the Hollowell/Holloway connection sat directly at the center of Natalie's disappearance. Abigail should have felt closer to answers. Instead, she felt something darker, because now the question was no longer whether Natalie had been hidden. It was whether an entire system had made people like Diane choose between survival and surrender. Abigail had spent weeks believing her mother was the victim in this story. That belief did not survive the courthouse records. Noah found the first document through a legal archive contact in Massachusetts who specialized in sealed probate access and abandoned civil filings. The paperwork was incomplete, heavily redacted in places, and difficult to interpret without context. But one section was unmistakable. A handwritten letter, filed in late 1997. Signed by Diane Carter. Abigail read it in Noah's office without speaking. The handwriting was unquestionably her mother's. She had seen birthday cards, grocery lists, margin notes in old paperbacks, signatures on school forms. There was no doubt. The letter addressed a family court judge overseeing an emergency custodial proceeding. Its language was raw in a way Abigail had never imagined Diane capable of. No polished restraint. No careful emotional editing. Fear. Desperation. Financial collapse. Isolation. Diane wrote that she could not support both infants. She wrote that promises had been made to her. She wrote that she had been told the girls would remain connected. She wrote that circumstances had changed. And then came the sentence Abigail could not unread. I am choosing Abigail because I believe I can keep her alive. Not because she is more important. Not because I love her more. Because I can keep her alive. Abigail read the sentence again. And again. Noah stayed silent. The silence was professional mercy. Then came the second document. Notarized. Early 1998. Legal relinquishment language. Diane Carter formally surrendering parental rights connected to infant twin A. In exchange, medical debt resolution. $18,600. That was the number. Hospital liability forgiveness structured through affiliated relief channels. The transactional brutality of it made Abigail physically cold in a way anger had not yet managed. Her sister. Priced. Noah explained carefully that poor women in crisis had historically been pressured into exploitative decisions through debt leverage, especially before modern oversight improved. But explanation did not soften impact. The legal language was clear. Diane signed. Abigail went home carrying copies she wished had never existed. For 2 days she avoided the Carter house. Then she returned. Not because she wanted memories, because secrets still seemed physically embedded there. By then, the house no longer felt like childhood. It felt like evidence storage. Abigail searched more methodically this time. Closets, old file drawers, storage bins. Boxes Diane had labeled with vague practicality. Tax, receipts, holiday, insurance, nothing. Then the attic. The journal appeared inside a weathered box beneath unrelated paperwork and old seasonal storage. Leather-bound. Used. Not decorative. A real private journal. Diane's handwriting confirmed it immediately. Abigail expected vague reflections. Maybe guilt. Maybe isolated mentions. Instead, she found chronology. Documented guilt. The first relevant entry came days after the twins' birth. I thought I would leave with both girls. He said that was unrealistic. Abigail stopped reading, then continued. Diane described pressure, not abstract financial stress, specific pressure. A man, calm, connected, certain. He told her she was unstable, under-resourced, unfit to manage twins alone. He described placement options, support programs, private assistance, better futures, language polished enough to sound humane. Diane's writing made one thing clear: choice had existed only in the technical sense. Later entries grew darker. July 1997. They took her today. No elaborate prose, just that sentence. Then, I hated myself before they even left. Another entry months later. Abigail asked if babies ever get lost. I told her no. Abigail read that twice. Memory flickered faintly, not as seen, as emotional residue. Questions asked long ago and erased by adult reassurance. Years passed across journal pages, scattered entries, brief confessions, repeated regret. Then one from 2005. I think I saw her. Abigail froze. Diane described recognizing a girl in public. Same eyes, same age, a wealthy woman nearby. No contact, no approach, only certainty. If true, Diane had located Natalie years earlier and done nothing. Another entry documented Abigail discovering the necklace, Diane admitting she lied about its origin. Another from 2014 asked whether Natalie hated her. Another from 2018 referenced terminal illness, cowardice, silence. And finally, the last entry, written days before Diane's death. I should tell her. If I do not, someone else must. Abigail closed the journal. She wanted fury. What arrived instead was something more complicated. Because Diane had suffered. That much was undeniable. But suffering and innocence are not synonyms. Diane had signed. Diane had concealed. Diane had watched Abigail grow up inside a fabricated story. Noah read selected entries later that evening. His interpretation was measured. Diane appeared both coerced and complicit, victim and participant. Not uncommon in institutional exploitation systems. People are easier to control once they've already crossed moral lines they regret. Abigail hated that he was probably right. The next breakthrough came through Beatrice Holloway. Abigail returned to her with copies of the journal. Beatrice was unsurprised by Diane's guilt. That reaction alone said enough. Then Beatrice revealed something worse. Diane had not entered St. Catherine as a random vulnerable patient. She had known people there before pregnancy. Volunteer programs, community maternal outreach, informal assistance initiatives. The hospital presented itself as supportive infrastructure for struggling women. According to Beatrice, some parts of that were genuine. Some were not. Richard Holloway helped fund associated community family services initiatives. Charitable on paper, selective in practice. Women with resources received support. Women without options received persuasion. Diane had participated around the edges of that ecosystem before becoming vulnerable herself. Not as mastermind, not even necessarily knowingly, but she had not been completely outside the system. That complicated everything. Abigail asked the question directly. Was my mother working with them? Beatrice answered carefully. No. But she trusted them before she understood what they really were. Then another detail emerged. A photograph. Beatrice had kept it in a separate envelope. St. Catherine Staff Event. 1996. Richard Holloway. Several administrative staff. Community volunteers. And Diane Carter. Not close together in a suspiciously intimate sense, but clearly acquainted. Abigail stared at the image for a long time, because betrayal always feels worse when it becomes visual. Her mother had known the machinery before being crushed by it. Noah took the photograph for document review. His independent research into Richard Holloway expanded rapidly. Political advisory roles, donor networks, quiet state influence, family legal relationships, and one devastating connection, the Hollowell family. name variations across generations, business and family lines that overlapped. Not identical spelling in every instance, but connected. Noah suspected deliberate distancing over time through legal structuring and social presentation. Enough connection to make Natalie's placement look far less coincidental. Then came the question Abigail had delayed too long. Did Natalie know any of this? Noah couldn't answer, but he had located something else. A more current identity trail. Natalie no longer appeared consistently under Hollowell. She had changed names. Recent records suggested deliberate legal identity adjustment. Not marriage. Personal petition. That mattered. People do not usually change names casually unless rejecting something. Noah continued digging. Abigail kept reading Diane's journal. Again and again. Looking for absolution. Finding none. Only ambiguity. One sentence returned repeatedly in her thoughts. I am choosing Abigail because I believe I can keep her alive. As rationalization, it was cruel. As maternal panic, it was understandable. As truth, it was devastating. Because it implied Diane believed Natalie would survive elsewhere. Just not with her. And maybe that belief had made betrayal emotionally survivable. Abigail understood something painful then. The opposite of love is not always indifference. Sometimes it is fear. And fear makes ordinary people sign extraordinary horrors. Still, understanding did not equal forgiveness. Not yet. Possibly not ever. Because every version of the story still ended the same way. Natalie disappeared. Abigail grew up alone. And Diane carried the truth into her grave instead of trusting her daughter with it. Noah found Natalie in October 2021. Not through miracle. Not through emotional intuition. Through paperwork. Identity changes leave traces, even when people think they've erased them. Private database records connected a legal name petition to a woman formerly listed under Natalie Hollowell. The new name was Natalie Mercer. The surname hit Abigail immediately. Dr. Harold Mercer, the physician whose name sat on the hospital discharge records. At first, the connection looked impossible. Then Noah mapped the family relationships. Harold Mercer had not merely been a physician affiliated with St. Catherine. He was connected to Natalie's adoptive family through marriage. Not direct parentage. Extended familial linkage. Close enough to matter. Close enough to raise the possibility that Natalie's destination had been arranged long before Diane signed anything. That realization transformed old suspicion into something uglier. Natalie had not simply been placed. She may have been selected. Noah spent weeks deciding whether to reach out. Abigail wanted immediate contact. Noah insisted on caution. There was too much emotional volatility, too much potential legal fallout, and too many unknowns about Natalie's current understanding of her own life. The eventual outreach was brief, professional, deliberately incomplete. No accusation. No dramatic revelation. Only a request for a private conversation regarding birth records and family history. Natalie declined the first request, ignored the second, responded to the third. One sentence. I know enough to understand this is probably real. That sentence changed Abigail's assumptions. Natalie already knew something. Not everything, perhaps, but something. The eventual meeting was arranged for early January 2022 in Boston. Neutral ground. No family homes. No lawyers. No journalists present beyond Noah's organizational role. Abigail arrived carrying the necklace. Not because she planned symbolism. Because by then it felt impossible not to. She had imagined this meeting in dozens of contradictory ways. Explosive confrontation. Emotional collapse. Instant recognition. Blank indifference. Reality was quieter and far worse. Because resemblance eliminated abstraction immediately. No need for explanation. No need for introductions. No need for proof of biology. Same face altered by different histories. Same eyes carrying completely different lives. 24 years of separation compressed into a single unbearable certainty. Natalie spoke first. Not warmly. Not cruelly. Just directly. She had seen photographs years earlier. Not Abigail specifically, but evidence suggesting another child existed. Adoptive family records, partial medical paperwork, things hidden badly enough to be found by a determined teenager. The knowledge had never been complete, only enough to create rage. Natalie had spent years believing some version of abandonment. That a birth mother chose one child and discarded the other. That a twin existed somewhere and never looked for her. Abigail absorbed that in silence. Because how do you defend absence you never knew existed? When Abigail explained she had only learned the truth months earlier, Natalie believed her faster than expected. Not because trust existed, because the evidence was impossible to fake. Abigail placed the half-heart necklace on the table. Natalie went still, then reached into her own bag. The second half. Same chain wear, same aged silver, same missing edge. 2 pieces fitting together with mathematical cruelty. No coincidence survived that moment. Their mother had divided the necklace. 1 piece for each daughter. A gesture that somehow made everything more heartbreaking. Not less. Because Diane had remembered both, even while surrendering one. The conversation that followed did not resemble reunion fantasies. There were no instant tears, no dramatic embrace, only history laid out in painful fragments. Natalie described growing up inside wealth that always felt conditional. Elite schooling, structured expectations, expensive opportunities, emotional restraint disguised as family stability. Questions about biological history were discouraged early. Shut down later, eventually punished. Natalie discovered the twin A wristband as a teenager, confronted her adoptive mother, received denial first, then anger, then silence. From that point forward, family relationships deteriorated. Trust never recovered. Abigail explained Diane, the letters, the hidden records, Beatrice, Richard Hollowell, the journal, the relinquishment agreement, the $18,600. That number changed Natalie's expression in a way nothing else had. Not shock, humiliation. So that was my price. Abigail tried to explain coercion, economic desperation, institutional pressure. Natalie rejected simplification immediately, because from her perspective, signatures still existed. Intentions mattered less than outcomes. Someone chose. She lived with that outcome. And for the first time, Abigail understood that both truths could coexist. Diane may have been manipulated. Natalie was still abandoned. No single moral framework resolved that contradiction. Natalie asked why Abigail had not found her sooner. Abigail answered honestly, because she did not know, because she had spent her life inside a lie, because Diane took the truth to her grave. Natalie accepted the answer intellectually. Emotionally, acceptance was slower. Still, she stayed. That mattered. They spent hours exchanging timelines, comparing childhood medical histories, family habits, coincidences, preferences, fragments of resemblance beyond genetics. Small similarities emerged awkwardly. Shared dislike of artificial sweetener, matching sleep issues, the same tendency toward over-preparation, same preference for older books over digital reading. Harmless details that felt devastating precisely because they should have developed together. Natalie described changing her surname deliberately, not for marriage, not for reinvention, for separation. Mercer had become a strategic name because it created distance from Hollowell while preserving access to certain documentation. That revelation surprised Noah more than Abigail. Natalie had been investigating her own history independently for years, just without enough proof to move forward. Their lives had been running parallel investigations without knowing it. At some point, Abigail realized the conversation had shifted, not into forgiveness, not into trust, into possibility. That was enough. When the meeting ended, Natalie agreed to future contact. No promises beyond that. No declarations. No cinematic closure. Just continuation. Abigail returned to Portland emotionally hollowed out in a way different from grief. Because grief mourns what existed. This was mourning what never got to exist. The birthdays, shared childhood references, inside jokes, ordinary sibling irritation, 24 years of small, invisible absences. Noah checked in later that evening. His question was simple. Did it help? Abigail's answer took longer. Yes and no. Because Natalie was real. Because Natalie was angry. Because Natalie had every right to be. And because reality, once finally reached, was far more complicated than longing had imagined. Still, something irreversible had changed. Natalie was no longer a hidden file, no longer twin A, no longer anonymous evidence. She was a person, an Abigail's sister, even if neither of them knew yet what to do with that truth. Abigail expected the weeks after meeting Natalie to feel transformative. Instead, they felt awkward. Truth does not automatically create intimacy. Biology does not erase 24 years of separate conditioning. And anger, once justified, does not dissolve because evidence arrives. Natalie responded to messages inconsistently at first, sometimes within hours, sometimes after days, sometimes not at all. The conversations were cautious, factual, almost administrative. Medical history, birth documentation, questions about dates, names, legal filings, corrections to timelines. The kind of exchanges two people might have if assembling a case rather than building a relationship. And maybe that was exactly what they were doing. Abigail returned to work in January 2022 with a version of herself her colleagues immediately noticed. Not because she became openly emotional, because she became present. For years, Abigail had moved through life with disciplined distance. She fulfilled obligations efficiently, maintained professional boundaries, declined invitations with polite consistency, and kept emotional access limited to nearly no one. Now that structure had cracks. Not dramatic ones, human ones. She accepted coffee with coworkers, stayed after department meetings instead of leaving immediately, responded when people asked how she was rather than defaulting to fine. No one understood why. No one needed to. For the first time in years, Abigail no longer felt like she was protecting an invisible wound she couldn't name. Because now it had a name. Natalie. Meanwhile, Noah's investigation escalated. What began as private fact-finding had evolved into legitimate journalistic exposure. Not because Abigail asked him to publish. Because evidence demanded scrutiny. Noah moved carefully. No identifying names. No exposure of living private victims. No reckless accusations. But his independent newsletter released the first article in February 2022. The headline focused on legacy failures in closed maternal health systems and unregulated infant placement practices in the late 1990s. Inside were anonymized details, administrative irregularities, private transfer coding, institutional coercion mechanisms, philanthropic intermediaries with political ties, women pressured under debt, children routed through opaque legal pathways. The article spread further than expected. Former employees reached out quietly. A retired nurse shared fragmented memories. A former clerk confirmed unusual file suppression. A family law assistant recalled sealed emergency paperwork involving newborn custody irregularities. Nothing definitive enough yet for criminal prosecution, but enough to validate the larger pattern. Natalie read the article before Abigail mentioned it. Her message was brief. So it wasn't just me. That sentence changed something. For the first time, the story became bigger than personal abandonment. Not less painful, but differently painful. Natalie began opening up in pieces. About childhood. About how privilege had looked from the inside. People assume wealth guarantees safety. Sometimes it only guarantees polish. Natalie described a household where achievement mattered more than honesty. Where family reputation dictated conversation boundaries. Where gratitude was expected. Where questions about origin were interpreted as disloyalty. When she found the hidden hospital bracelet years earlier, confrontation with her adoptive mother ended badly enough that she stopped asking directly. Instead, She researched quietly, changed her name, collected fragments, waited. Abigail listened without trying to reshape Natalie's anger into something more comfortable, because some anger deserves room. Their second in-person meeting happened with less tension. Still not warmth, but less guardedness. Natalie brought documentation she had uncovered independently. Fragments of adoption-adjacent paperwork. A therapist intake form mentioning early placement trauma. A household financial trust amendment from 1998. References that implied negotiation rather than ordinary adoption. Abigail brought Diane's journal excerpts. Not all of them, only selected pages. Natalie read them slowly. The emotional reaction was difficult to interpret. Not forgiveness, certainly not absolution, but something softer than pure hatred. Eventually Natalie asked the question Abigail had feared. Did she love me? Abigail answered honestly. Yes. And she failed you. Both can be true. Natalie did not argue. That silence mattered. Then came the name change. In April 2022, Natalie formally updated her legal identity again. This time not Mercer. Not Hollowell. Whitaker, no, wrong continuity. Must remain Carter. Carter. Natalie Carter. Abigail learned through official notice Natalie forwarded directly. No explanation attached. None was necessary. It was not sentimental reclamation. It was ownership. A decision to define herself outside every imposed version of her past. Around the same time, Abigail took the broken necklace to a jeweler. The original instinct had been simple repair. Restore what had been separated. But the emotional reality was stranger. Could two lives divided this long actually become whole? The jeweler repaired the seam so carefully it was nearly invisible. When Abigail showed Natalie the finished necklace, the response was quieter than she expected. Not because it meant little, because it meant too much. They agreed neither should permanently keep both halves. The necklace would move between them. Shared custody of symbolism. An arrangement both found unexpectedly fitting. Then came Diane's grave. The visit was Natalie's suggestion. Abigail almost refused. Not because she wanted to protect Diane. Because she wanted to protect Natalie from an experience she might regret. Natalie insisted. No dramatic confrontation happened there. No emotional breakdown. Just difficult honesty. Natalie admitted she had imagined this moment for years. In earlier versions, she thought hatred would feel cleaner, more satisfying. Instead it felt unfinished. Because dead people cannot answer, cannot explain, cannot apologize. Abigail admitted something equally uncomfortable. She still loved Diane. That confession carried guilt. Natalie's response was not anger, just recognition that emotional truth rarely follows moral neatness. People can love damaged parents. People can resent them simultaneously. No law of psychology forbids contradiction. That shared understanding created more intimacy than any biological revelation had. Afterward, their communication changed. Less investigative, more personal. Still imperfect. Still interrupted by tension. But real. They exchanged mundane details. Book recommendations. Work frustrations. Bad family memories. Random observations. Things ordinary sisters should have spent decades sharing. Abigail realized one night that she had begun instinctively thinking in plural. We, not I. Tiny shift. Enormous meaning. Noah continued receiving outreach from possible related cases. Some stories collapsed under scrutiny. Some remained plausible. A few were deeply disturbing. The scope of St. Catherine's hidden history might never be fully known. Abigail understood by then that justice, in any prosecutorial sense, was unlikely. Too much time. Too many dead participants. Too much document loss. But exposure still mattered. Truth still mattered. And then, unexpectedly, gratitude surfaced. Not toward the system. Never that. Toward whoever sent the first letter. The anonymous catalyst. Without them, none of this would have happened. Natalie would remain an abstraction. Abigail would remain incomplete without understanding why. The sender never identified themselves. Perhaps they never would. But by summer 2022, Abigail understood something she would once have thought impossible. Her life had not been repaired. Repair suggests restoration of an original condition. That was impossible. She and Natalie could never recover childhood, never reclaim lost birthdays, never become what they should have been. But they could build something real from damaged truth. And for the first time since February 2021, that possibility felt less like fantasy and more like choice. By late 2022, Abigail stopped measuring progress by emotional breakthroughs. That had been an early mistake. Healing, she learned, was not cinematic. No single conversation erased 24 lost years. No symbolic gesture repaired betrayal. No document delivered moral clarity. What existed instead was repetition. Messages answered. Messages ignored. Coffee that became conversation. Conversation that became silence. Then resumed again. A relationship built the ordinary way, except with extraordinary baggage. Natalie remained difficult in ways Abigail had learned not to personalize. Some days she was sharp, detached, impatient with sentiment. Other days unexpectedly thoughtful, funny, observant in ways that felt eerily familiar. Trust moved inconsistently. Forward, then sideways. Never backward completely. That was enough. In August, Abigail received a call from Noah. Beatrice Hollowell had died. Natural causes. 81. No prolonged warning. No dramatic final statement. Just an ending. For Abigail, the news landed harder than expected. Beatrice had entered her life as a witness. She became something stranger than family and more personal than a source. Someone who remembered the beginning when Abigail herself could not. The funeral was small, quiet. A few former co-workers. One distant relative. A neighbor who handled practical arrangements. No public acknowledgement of what Beatrice had preserved. No mention of the records she refused to destroy. No recognition of the lives altered by her refusal to obey institutional silence. Abigail attended. So did Natalie. That mattered. Not because reconciliation had been completed. Because showing up is its own language. After the service, an attorney handling Beatrice's estate requested a brief meeting. Beatrice had left something specifically for Abigail. A sealed storage archive. Paper files. Photographic copies. Internal St. Catherine records. Administrative transfer notes. Patient code logs. And a handwritten note. Not sentimental. Simple. You were never paperwork. Neither was she. Do something honest with this. Abigail read the note twice. Natalie read it once and looked away. The archive confirmed what Noah already suspected. Natalie and Abigail were not isolated cases. Not definitively dozens. But enough to establish a pattern. Young mothers in unstable circumstances. Administrative ambiguity. Private transfer language. Connections to intermediaries with money or influence. Some stories likely legal. Some almost certainly not. Too much time had passed for easy legal accountability. Many primary actors were dead. Records were incomplete. Institutions dissolved. But truth, even delayed truth, still mattered. Noah asked whether Abigail wanted the records folded into a broader public investigation. She said yes. Not immediately. Not recklessly. But yes. Because silence had protected the wrong people for too long. That decision marked something important. The story stopped being only about personal recovery. It became about witness. Meanwhile, life continued in smaller, stranger ways. Natalie and Abigail developed routines that would have looked unremarkable to outsiders. Bookstore recommendations. Arguments about whether certain classic novels were overrated. Work complaints. Holiday awkwardness. The kind of relationship siblings usually inherit without effort. They had to build theirs manually. One interaction at a time. Sometimes Natalie shared fragments of her childhood that left Abigail stunned. Private schools where emotional vulnerability was treated like weakness. Family dinners structured like business meetings. an upbringing rich in opportunity but emotionally rationed. Abigail shared her own version. Public school budget cuts. Diane's overwork. Discount grocery math. The loneliness of being loved by someone emotionally unreachable. Neither woman envied the other's life as much as outsiders might assume. Pain does not compare cleanly across class lines. It just changes shape. In October, Abigail and Natalie took a short road trip together. Not as a grand healing ritual, because Natalie had a free weekend and Abigail impulsively said yes. That alone represented progress. They argued over directions, stopped at places neither planned, talked about nothing significant for hours, then something significant by accident. At one point, Natalie admitted she used to imagine Abigail as happier. A fantasy sibling spared abandonment. Abigail laughed at the irony. She had imagined Natalie as luckier, loved, wanted, protected. They sat with that contradiction. Two people envying fictional versions of each other while misunderstanding reality. Felt painfully human. Near the end of the trip, they entered a used bookstore. Abigail found an old copy of The Secret Garden, the same book she had loved as a child. Inside, an anonymous handwritten inscription read, "If you look the right way, you can see that the whole world is still capable of growing." Natalie called that suspiciously sentimental. Abigail bought it anyway. They shared the cost. Another accidental symbol. The final visit to Diane's grave happened in December 2022. Not because of anniversary significance, because unfinished things eventually demand witness. This time, neither woman came seeking answers. The dead had already given everything they could give. Truth, half-truth, silence, regret. Nothing new waited there. Abigail brought Diane's journal. The original. Not because she wanted to destroy evidence. Everything important had already been copied. Because some private pain no longer needed indefinite preservation. Natalie understood immediately. No discussion required. They buried the journal. Not as forgiveness. Not as absolution. As closure. Or perhaps acknowledgement that closure is never perfect. Abigail thought about the version of Diane who wrote desperate letters. The version who signed catastrophic paperwork. The version who loved one daughter while surrendering another. The version who carried guilt for decades. None erased the others. Human beings are rarely morally consistent enough to make grief convenient. Natalie eventually asked the question Abigail had once asked herself repeatedly. Do you ever wish none of this happened? Not the separation. Not the original crime. The discovery. The unraveling. The destruction of the old life. Abigail understood the distinction, because ignorance had once felt stable, predictable, safe. But safety built on falsehood is only delayed collapse. Her answer came without hesitation. No. Natalie nodded slowly. Same. That was all. No dramatic emotional release. No final declaration. Just two women who had spent a year reconstructing identity from institutional damage and inherited silence. When they left, Abigail understood something she had been approaching for months. People talk about finding missing pieces as though human beings are puzzles. As though somewhere there exists a perfectly intended original design waiting to be restored. But life does not work that way. Some losses cannot be recovered. Some childhoods do not come back. Some apologies arrive too late. Some mothers fail both through cruelty and fear at the same time. Some institutions destroy lives while calling it help. And some truths arrive decades after they should. Still, truth matters. Not because it repairs everything, because it allows honest living afterward. Abigail once believed family was something proven by history, paperwork, or uninterrupted presence. Now she understood something more difficult. Family can begin in blood, can be destroyed by choice, can survive betrayal. It can be rebuilt slowly between strangers who should have known each other all along. And sometimes the most human thing we can do is refuse to let another person remain lost simply because too much time has passed. Because being found late is still better than never being found at all. Thank you sincerely for spending your time with us and listening to today's story all the way through. In a world that moves so quickly, choosing to pause and connect with a story about truth, loss, forgiveness, and human resilience means more than you may realize. Stories like this remind us that life is rarely simple. People make painful choices, sometimes out of fear, weakness, love, or desperation. Not every wound heals neatly, and not every truth arrives when we wish it would. But even so, truth still matters. Compassion still matters. And sometimes, even after years of silence, broken relationships can begin to heal when courage and honesty finally take their place. If there is one lesson to carry with you from today's story, it is this. No matter how much time has passed, it is never too late for truth to change a life, and it is never too late for people to find their way back to one another. If this story touched your heart, moved your thoughts, or reminded you of someone in your own life, we would truly love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective may comfort or inspire someone else reading them. And if you would like to support our channel and help us continue bringing meaningful stories like this to you, the simplest way is to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for being here with us. Until the next story, take care of yourself and those you love.